Number 1.
For reference, I'm a young man, originally from Texas. In the summer of 1997, my friend and I experienced something impossible, and it has made me a firm believer in the paranormal. I was 16 at the time, and my 3 friends, Mike, Abe, and Tim, were all sitting around acting all macho, trying to make it seem like we were each the toughest one in the group. Tim threw down the gauntlet and made the claim that he wandered through the cemetery at night before, and bet that none of us would have the balls to do that. Mike immediately took the bait and replied that for $50 he would do it, to which Tim agreed. I decided I wanted in on the action as well, and said that I would do it too for $50, and in turn Abe took on that bet as well. Looking back, I'm sure that between the 4 of us, we didn't even have $20, but this was all just tough talk from bored kids after all. This cemetery did have a history of creepy activity. Screams have been heard in the dead of night on occasion from behind the rusty gates. A homeless man had once crawled into a freshly dug grave and then killed himself, and a police officer once went on record in the 70s saying that he saw a shadowy figure with yellow eyes cross in front of his patrol car when he was right outside the main entrance. Setting anything paranormal aside, this was rural Texas after all, and there was also the very real danger of being bitten by a snake or attacked by a coyote or other wild animals in the dark. Of course, we were young and felt invincible, so putting all of the possible dangers out of our heads, we met at my place at midnight and made for the cemetery. None of us thought to bring flashlights, which I suppose shows just how clearly we were all thinking. Abe had brought a stopwatch and told Mike and I that we had to stay deep within the cemetery walls for exactly 1 hour, which meant out of earshot from them. We couldn't just hop the fence and sit there. Anything short of an hour, and we would have to pay them. Mike and I climbed the fence, which I remember snagging my shoelace on, because when I stopped to retie it, on the other side Tim began to tease me through the bars that I was already starting to chicken out. Mike and I remained side by side, and I walked up the path into the deep maze of headstones. I remember us talking about random shit like football and the Terminator movies, and we were overall much more bored than scared. After a while, we sat down and just leaned against 2 different headstones and just kept talking. I remember tracing my finger in the etching of the stone and thinking about how I would spend my $50. When I heard a noise, I didn't want to appear afraid in front of Mike, so for a while I kept it to myself, but I was sure I could hear muttering, like a deep throaty whispering, as if someone was talking to themselves. After a long silence, Mike and I turned to look at each other, and I remember by his body language that he was spooked. It didn't sound like someone deliberately trying to frighten us, because it wasn't overly creepy, but it was strange in the sense that it just didn't seem like a normal thing to hear, given where we were. Mike made a comment about maybe it was a homeless guy, and maybe he was drunk and wandering around somewhere, and perhaps we should probably go. We both got up quick and half walked, half jogged to the entrance, having no idea for how long exactly we had been there. What happened next is something that I'll never forget, and it kept me awake for several weeks afterwards. Even to this day, when I'm alone in the dark and remember it, I get chills and feel like a child again. Mike suddenly stopped in his tracks and screamed, "Something's got me!" Before I could even fully turn around, Mike hit the ground and started wailing as something began pulling him back by his legs, the sound of his body being dragged through the gravel nearly as loud as his screams. I rushed back and grabbed him by the arms and pulled him, and suddenly Mike was in the air, being held aloft between 2 opposing forces pulling at him, except there was nothing there. I don't mean it was too dark to see anything. I mean I saw his legs hanging in midair, slightly higher than where I was holding his arms, as if the invisible thing was taller. Suddenly the thing released its grip and we both ran. We sprinted up the path so hard that once we reached the gate, we nearly had the momentum to leap over it. Once we were over the other side, Tim and Abe started to say something, but we just kept running. We ran all the way back to my place and collapsed exhausted on the front lawn, under the comforting light that was coming from the kitchen window. After a few minutes, Tim and Abe caught us, freaking out, saying that they had seen something within the gates, some kind of figure coming towards them, and they booked it. But when they had stopped at the street corner, Abe had turned to see it still coming, having passed through the gates and continuing up the street. My memory is just mostly a blur after that. Mike was wailing that his leg hurt, and there was a long scratch down by his ankle. Tim and Abe were babbling about how the thing was still after us, and we made so much noise that my parents came outside and yelled at us for making such a commotion. Obviously, my parents didn't believe us, and they never called the police. Mike was never the same after that night. He would complain about nightmares, where he would hear murmuring in the dark, and he eventually killed himself about 2 years later with one of his dad's guns. Abe got seriously drunk in 2001 and wandered into a street and was hit by a truck and killed instantly. It was the same street the cemetery was on. Tim nearly died of an overdose in 2005, and in 2006 he was convicted of 2 counts of manslaughter for driving under the influence and was sent to prison. I visited him once. He said he felt safe and that the nightmares about the shadowy figures weren't as bad inside. He's still in prison today. He says that he never wants to leave. I no longer live in Texas, and though I've grown up to be a well-adjusted adult, I've never visited a cemetery since. And every time a non-believer talks to me about hoaxes and superstition, I just quietly nod and wish I could go back to thinking like they do.
Number 2.
I grew up in a small town in Virginia. There were rolling country hills, only one high school, and everyone was your neighbor. That sort of thing. It was me, my mother, my father, and my brother, who was 6 years older than me. My town was so small, in fact, that my grandparents and my great-grandmother lived within a mile away from each other. I don't remember too much about my great-grandmother. I just remember that she was always very grumpy, and she would always yell at my brother and I when we would go over her house to play. My brother and I would do this because our own house was very small, and her house was a nice big open Cape Cod style house with plenty of room to run around and spread out our toys. When she eventually died, it took a toll on my family because within that very same week, my grandfather passed away as well. So my grandma lost her mom and her husband both within a few days, and she was left to live alone. As I grew older, I started to notice just how creepy her house was. Sometimes when my brother and I were visiting, my grandmother would be occupied with her Avon, and we would sneak upstairs to snoop through all the rooms. But one room especially always caught my attention. I found myself feeling a deep feeling of unease or dread whenever I would go near it. It was just a normal bedroom, very small, with hardwood floors, only a twin bed and a small dresser, and also a lot of junk. Old Christmas boxes, Avon products, and my great-grandmother's worn clothes. Over in the corner of the room, right beside a small crawl-in storage area, was a mirror. For some reason, I always found myself strangely attracted to this mirror. It gave me a very uneasy feeling, one I can still very much remember to this day. I often caught my brother giving it a strange glance every now and then too. It wasn't until I started seeing this mirror in my dreams that I began to question its history. The dreams were very vivid and eerie. They would start with me standing on the porch of the house. It was quiet all around me, with a slight breeze, and the dream progressed with me making my way into the house. Except, I wasn't walking. I was floating. Whenever I would enter a room, the door would open for me. All the lights were off, but I could still see the full moon eerily casting its light through the open windows. The outside breeze making the curtains dance all around. In the dream, I'm not scared or curious. It was like I was meant to be there. I make my way upstairs, where I'm guided each time to the same room. This is the part of the dream where I begin to sense fear and dread. I make my way in front of the mirror, but oddly enough, I never see my reflection. I'm forced to stare at it, when suddenly, an apparition of my great-grandmother appears. Her skin looks gray and cold. Her eyes are dark and hollow. The uneasy feeling intensifies as I stare. I'm scared to death by now, and I need to wake myself up somehow. Then abruptly, the image in the mirror turns sinister. The mouth opens wide, and she lets out the most terrifying scream I've ever heard. This is the point where I always wake up, covered in sweat. I had that same dream countless times growing up, but I never knew its significance. And I never told anyone, not even my grandmother. My grandmother lost her battle to cancer on Mother's Day, and my family began cleaning her house. At this point, I had not had the dream about the mirror in roughly 10 years. But when my brother and I, now in our 30s, had the duty of cleaning that room, the eeriness of it all returned to me. "We had a lot of fun times snooping around up here, didn't we?" he said. "I barely remember it, but yes, fun times," I replied. My brother then lifted his finger and pointed. "Hey, do you remember that mirror right there?" I felt a chill go down my spine as I replied, "Yeah, why do you ask?" I'm not sure if you ever knew, but that mirror was Great Granny's from her childhood, and it just so happens that right below it, parallel to downstairs, is the chair that she died in. Number 3. So this happened in the winter of 2014. My mom and I had recently moved into this place in the previous winter in 2013. There's a lot of interpersonal details to the story that may have led up to or contributed to this incident, but I'm not comfortable sharing these issues here. I would also like to state that at this time, I was going through a mild depression commonly known as winter blues. This happens almost every year, and I generally don't think much of it. But in the winter of 2014, things were different. Everything felt like a burden. It was like a heavy fog in my life. I think I was unknowingly going through a deep depressive state. Anyway, it was late one night, and I didn't have school or work the next day. So I decided to stay up a little bit later than usual. I played some soft music and read a book until my eyes began to get heavy. After a glance at the clock, I decided it was time to head to bed. This is where shit gets creepy. About 3 hours into a deep sleep, I awoke only to fixate my eyes on what I can only describe as a fuzzy black ball rolling on the floor right next to my bed. At first I thought I was dreaming, but I realized I was wide awake when the glare of the nightlight came into focus. I gathered myself and calmly sat up to get a better look at this fuzzy black ball rolling from my bed to my closet and back again, for what was probably mere seconds, but it honestly felt like an eternity. All of a sudden, this fuzzy black thing stopped rolling and started to morph. I clenched my sheets in my hands, anticipating what was about to happen. Right before my eyes, it quickly morphed into a black, willowy, thin, tall shadow creature. Saying that I was scared would be an understatement. I said in a loud voice, "What the fuck are you?" And then, it disappeared. Apparently my mom had been in the kitchen making coffee. She walked into my room and saw me sitting up and asked me who I was talking to. I told her what I saw, and she told me that a couple of nights after we first moved in, she experienced something similar. And my mother wasn't suffering from any emotional distress like I was, and she saw it too. I get very creepy vibes when I start thinking about it, and I hope I never have to see that thing again.
Number 4.
I had this supervisor named Kate. One day we had a discussion that turned into the unexplained, and she told me about something that happened when she was a teenager. This was in the summer after she graduated high school, sometime in the late 1990s. She was 18 at the time. Her friend Billy was a few years older, but still lived with his mother. This was in a small city in western Maryland, and Billy's house just had enough land that he could throw raging day-to-night summer parties, complete with bonfires. At the same time, they weren't totally isolated, and random people from the surrounding neighborhoods would often show up at these parties. One day, Billy met this skater kid named Nick at a park one morning, and being the social animal guy that he is, Billy invited him to hang out with him at his house. Billy probably also took pity on Nick, because Nick told him that he was a runaway who was living at the park. They would basically play video games, go on rides, and party until late night. Nick started showing up every day at Billy's house, knocking on the door at 7 a.m. sharp, and engaging him in the morning till night drinking. He was about 16, with dark eyes and dark spiky hair. He seemed fairly normal, except for a few things. The first was that he always wore the same thing: a plain t-shirt and a pair of camo print cargo shorts. Despite the fact that he was sleeping at a park, his clothes always seemed to be clean. The second is that he was never seen eating or going to the bathroom, despite the fact that Nick was always drinking heavily with Billy. Finally, oddly enough, no one remembers actually feeling Nick's skin, even my supervisor, who sat next to him during a road trip. She hung out with Billy and Nick at Billy's house 2 times, and each time she said that she and her friend felt like something was very off with Nick, especially when he would give off this laugh that just sounded very evil and maniacal. He also seemed to get stranger when they went on a road trip and got further away from Billy's city. Nick would also never shut up about his father's gun collection. Finally, Billy's hospitality reached its limits after 2 weeks of Billy waking up at 7 a.m. to go party. Billy snapped at Nick at his front door and said, "Look, Nick, you've been coming here every morning for 2 weeks. You're waking up my mother who's trying to sleep. You really need to go now. Please just come back later." Then he slammed the door shut. Nick never showed up again. Billy came to Kate later with a newspaper article that was about Nick, who had apparently killed himself. Nick had escaped from the mental asylum his parents had put him in, that was located in Billy's town. When he got back to his parents' house, he shot himself with his father's gun. Billy was originally upset because he felt that he must have pushed Nick over the edge when he kicked him out, until he checked the dates. Nick had committed suicide on July 10th, 2 weeks before they met.
There's always a reason to be afraid.